Like any one of these beds, if you dig in, you find this here. This is a strawberry bed. Nice, soft, beautiful black stuff. That's not what I started with, okay? That is not this beautiful black gold. That's not what I started with. Hey, it's Greg here with MaritimeGardening.com, and I thought I would do a video talking about, whether you're trying to build a garden or expand your garden, various considerations on how to go about doing that. Useful for either the new gardener or a person who's got a small garden. And I know a lot of people are thinking this way this year of expanding their garden, making it bigger. They want to grow more of their own food. So, if you want to grow more of your own food, then you want to have the best chance at doing it. So I thought I'd share my insights on doing that. And I guess the two main themes I'm going to talk about is location. Three main themes: location, design, and soil. Right? Those are arguably the more important considerations. Location. I mean, once you choose a location, you're kind of invested in that. You've put your time in. You're certainly invested for the season. So if you've chosen a bad location, you got to wait a year to choose another location. And if you had a lawn where you put your garden in, if it was in the wrong spot, you got to put a lawn back, right? And choose some other spot. So it's a fairly important decision. One of the things that aggravates me the most, not aggravates, I guess, just I don't understand it, is when you talk to people and they say, I didn't have very good results last year. What do you think I did wrong? That's the vague question, right? And the first question I ask is, well, is it sunny where your garden is? I can't speak to every climate. I live in Nova Scotia, Canada, and it's sunlight and shiny sun and heat can be hard to come by here. So if you're somewhere really, really hot, maybe shade's important, I suppose. I know in really hot places, there's a time of the summer where the garden's actually shut down. It's just too hot for a lot of things to grow. That's not a problem here. It's more about getting a good start in the spring, right? And to get a good start in the spring, your garden has to be located somewhere where the sun is going to shine down on it to the best of its ability when it is actually shining. You can see right now I don't know if you can tell, but it's an overcast day right now. It's overcast all day today. And I've got, I don't know if it's in the frame here, but I've got various microclimates in my garden everywhere. Domes, little different kinds of like mini greenhouses and things like that. And they're having no effect today because there's no sun. The sun's up in a sense, right? There's light. But there's no sun, there's no radiation, there's nothing really acting on those microclimates to heat them up. So I need sun. And when there is sun, I need to get the most of it as possible. So people have a tendency to tuck their garden into that corner of the yard that's, off to the side. That little corner there, little corner there, that space there. Basically, their consideration in terms of designing their space, they're considering the garden last, right? They're making it the lowest priority. They're making a higher priority the flowers, the lawn, various features, the deck, all those sorts of things, and they're putting the garden at the bottom of the priority. Where, if your goal is to grow food, then you should be giving the garden the best land so it can do it. And the best land is where it's going to get all the sun it needs to grow the things you want. So, get a sense, get a compass, or use an app on your phone and figure out, which way is north, which way is south, which way is west, which way is east, right? And where on your property is it getting the most of the sun relative to those directions over the course of the day? Go out in the morning, go out in the evening, go out at midday. Is there a place that's never in the shade, right? That should be like the middle of your garden sort of thing, right? Those places are the best places. If you're challenged for sunlight, especially in a northern climate, right, they'll thaw out first. That soil will warm up first. The life that's in the soil will start becoming active first. If you have any perennials, they'll start growing that much sooner, right? So all that, the sun is the energy. right? The sun is we're different than plants. We have to eat something to get energy. Plants get their energy from the sun, right? They take up water from the ground, some minerals and stuff like that. But they get their energy from the sun, and they capture it in their actual bodies. And then we eat them when we get it. So we're very different than them. That's the food. The food is up there. Right? And they're only going to get the food when the actual sun is shining on them. So that's the number one consideration. Choose a sunny spot. Choose a spot that's going to get warm, thaw out, and the plants are going to get all the sun they want, all the sun they need. Certain things you want to grow, heat-loving vegetables, they'll take all they can get, sort of thing, right? So choose the right spot. Number two, I got 3 points here, is design. I'm going to take you around the garden here and show you a little bit. Now, I guess I was speaking to sun. This is pretty much the sunniest spot on my property. I'm surrounded by trees, but it's actually away from my house. Your house casts shade. So if you're going to have a garden near your house, the house should be north of your garden, right? The garden should be here, and north of the garden should be the house. In the early spring, before the equinox, before the spring equinox, the sun is actually rising in the southeast and in the southwest. So it's important that, so if your garden is north of anything, it's not going to get any light. So you want the house on the north of your garden so that there's nothing blocking your garden from south. If you look towards the south, the sun is somewhere between the horizon and straight up, but it's not straight up, it's near the horizon, right? So your garden has got to be there, not just in terms of the growing season, but in terms of the sun's ability to just minimize the effect of winter on your garden, create a microclimate, right? Make it a little bit warmer where your garden is. At some point around the equinox, the sun starts rising due east, due west, right? And then at some point later on in the season, it actually rises in the northeast and sets in the northwest. That's when you're getting the most sun, and it goes straight up overhead, right? So all those different things need to be taken into consideration, but it's easy to solve. If you have a house and the garden has to be next to the house because you only got so much land, you got to put the garden right against the house on the south side, would be my advice. Second choice would be maybe on the west side. I find the west side of the house always tends to be warmer than the east side. The east side gets the sun in the morning, but you got to think about it. If I had to choose if I could choose whether to put my garden on the east or the west side of the house, right up against the house, sort of thing. On the east side of the house, it does get the morning sun, but when the sun comes up, it's been cold all night. So there hasn't been much warming, let's put it that way. You got the sun that comes up, it goes all the way to the top, and then it starts going back down, and then you're getting the western side of your house. It's getting the sun. Well, by around noon, right, by the time the sun actually starts shining on the western side of your house, the air planet where you live has been warming up all morning long, right? So it's just that much warmer. The soil is actually still getting indirect heat, ambient heat from the atmosphere, all that sort of stuff, right? So the soil has been warming up all day to an extent. So when the sun actually finally starts to shine on your soil, when it's, this way's west, right? When it goes over the top of your house and it's starting to shine down on the western side of your house, right? It's already warmed up a little bit, so it's sort of hitting the ground running, right? So that's some considerations on that. Why did I bring a single post-it note out here? Anyway, the other issue is design. And design, that's important, not just in terms of how much money you put into building it, which I would recommend put as little into it as possible, but also just how successful the garden can be. The first piece of advice I would give would be to resist the urge to build a giant mighty rectangle that you walk in with rows. That's the kind of garden I grew up with. I would take on the preference of, many no-till gardeners. Not guys with YouTube channels like me, but like experienced gardeners who've written books on the subject and that sort of thing. Having beds, right? In my garden, there's basically places you walk and places you don't walk. And you always walk in the walking places, and you never walk in the not walking places, right? That way, the only soil that's getting compacted is the place where you don't want things to grow, right? Every time I take a step, there's 215 pounds of man pushing down on the ground, right? So that's great in a walking path because I don't really want stuff to grow there. It's just going to get that much more compacted over time. I don't want that pushing down on my garden soil. So you have walking paths and you have garden beds, right? Now, what you make the beds out of doesn't really matter. I've seen guys on YouTube build them out of cinder blocks and just shill out ridiculous amounts of money. I've used, I like using some of my beds here. I'll just show you. So these ones over here, they're bordered with rocks. Rocks are easy to come by where I live. There's basically an undeveloped piece of land just over here. And because it's Nova Scotia, there's just granite rocks and other kinds of rocks everywhere, right? Rocks the size of basketballs sort of thing and larger. So there's an almost infinite number of rocks. So they're good for a border of a garden. They cost nothing, they last forever. The rocks gather heat. During the winter, and when things are starting to thaw out, the rock-bordered gardens thaw out first, every time. Because the rock gathers heat during the day. Especially if you're lucky and your rocks are a dark in color, right? So they're free, they gather heat. Not only that, but the soil underneath the rocks almost never seems to dry out, right? The rock heats up, but it also stays cool underneath. It's kind of interesting, right? So why is that important? So you've got I'm going to talk about this a little bit more as we go along, but you've got an organic mulch over your entire garden bed. And that's keeping the soil from drying out, and it's feeding the organisms in the soil, which in turn makes the soil richer and feeds your plants. Now, I guess, some minerals are escaping from those rocks, trace amounts, right? But because that soil the soil underneath the rocks is perpetually covered, there's always water there. So when you plant vegetables near the rocks, they grow really well. Even though the rocks aren't really providing any nitrogen or anything like that to the soil, they're hot, so the plants like the heat, some plants, and they're keeping the soil underneath them from drying out. If you grow potatoes in a rock-bordered garden, your biggest potatoes are often like nestled in next to the rocks because there's the moisture there, and so those roots are seeking it out, right? So yeah, rocks is a good one, and you'll notice in my beds here with the rock-bordered gardens, the soil is like maybe 2 inches above grade. Often people watch my channel and they say, raised beds, raised beds, raised beds. The majority of my gardens are like 3-4 inches above grade. That's it. They might have a box around the garden, and the box might be 6 inches high. I think my highest boxes might be 10 or 12 inches high. But the soil is nowhere near that high relative to grade, relative to the actual soil level. And I've found over time that, in general, I get better results when the soil's low. And that's an advantage too because, you don't have to buy it, right? I'll talk more about that as we go along. Let me show you a couple other different garden types. So, I like these design. I've got different kinds of lumber, different dimensions of lumber that I've used in my garden. I've got 4x10 beds. I've got 4x8 beds. I've got beds that are like 6x6. Generally speaking, I like the 4x8 bed, and I think it's a good size for most people. The longer the bed is, it becomes an obstacle to get around, right? This one here is 10 feet long. It's just a bit much. 4x8 is just right for me, and when it's 4 feet, for me anyway, it's not a big deal to reach across, and I think most people, interviewed Lee Reich once. He's a master gardener. He likes 3.5 feet. He's a good deal shorter than me. I'm 6'4", so I mean, you adjust these things relative to your own body. But I can reach across 4, and I could have these beds being 5 feet wide and still manage. But it's the middle of the bed is comfortable for me. Further than that becomes difficult. And I imagine as you get older and older, if you have any issues with your back, it could cause problems. So there's that. In terms of lumber, I would get the cheapest lumber you can find. It's all going to rot, right? even if it's made of some magical stuff. And there's some things that are better than others, and depending on where you live, those materials might be easier to come by, relatively speaking. Like locust is a very rot resistant wood, but you can't really come by it where I live. Tamarack is something you can come by here in Nova Scotia. It's not easy to get, but you can get it, and that's rot resistant. It still rots, and if you're paying more for it, it's going to rot anyway. I don't see the point. These beds were just made out of like ordinary lumberyard 2x6, right? That's what I like to use for beds. I wouldn't go any higher than 2x6, and I'd only fill the soil up a little bit, sort of thing, right? And I just replaced, there's a board right here, right? I just replaced this side because I just did it yesterday. It's rotted out. So I mean, that's what you get. Let's say I built that bed in 2013, maybe? I would say 2013, and it's 2020 now. So 7 years, right? That's about it, right? I got 7 years out of it. Now, I mean, they're all that age, so this is the first one to go. So I think the other side of this bed was going to last this year, and next year I'll need to replace it. So 8 years, let's say 10 years, right? But that also depends on your climate and where you live. I mean, I live in Nova Scotia. If you take a walk in the forest here, all the granite rocks that are above the soil level, well, not all of them, but a good many of them, they're covered in moss, right? Because it's moist here, it's a wet environment. So if you're in Arizona or Texas or something like that, I imagine wood could probably live a lot longer, or last a lot longer without rotting out. Of course, you might have termites and stuff like that. And people are always asking me about termites. I don't have them here. So I've never really looked into it because I don't have to. I would go on message boards, websites, Facebook, and so on, and talk to no-till gardeners. You know, we always have our gardens covered with mulch, and a lot of people use wood chips and stuff like that, and use rotten logs for different sorts of things like horticulture beds. I'll talk about that as we go along as well. I don't really know how you deal with termites in that situation. I don't have it as a problem here. I do have ants. I got ants everywhere, and I don't bother them, and they don't bother me. I just let them. I share my garden with ants. The only time ants can be, I'm getting off topic here, but these questions tend to come up. The only time ants are a problem for me is sometimes you get an aphid problem on a plant, and the ants really like the aphids, so they protect the aphids from predators. When you see that happening, for me, you just take out the aphids, right? Using whatever means. I use insecticidal soap. Some people just brush them off with water and stuff like that. When you got a 2,500, 3,000 square foot garden and a full-time job and a wife and 2 kids, you kind of want to just solve things faster. So little insecticidal soap in the broader scheme of things, especially if you're using something that's, it's going to break down organically. I don't sweat it at all. That's a whole nother topic. Don't want to get into diatribe. So wood, 6 inches high. I just use spruce. Wherever you live, use what's cheap. It's not going to last forever anyway. No big deal. In dimensions, I should say, the 4x8 dimension's good. But if you think about efficiency and area and stuff like that, so a 4x8 garden uses, what is that? You're getting 4 times 8. You're getting 32 square feet of garden for 24 feet of 2x6. You can make a 6x6 bed and get 36 square feet of garden for the same amount of lumber, right? For 24 feet of lumber. So the square is a more efficient shape than the rectangle in terms of getting gardenable area per board foot, if you want to think about it that way, right? But then you've got the problem of being able to reach the middle, right? And sure, you could make small squares 4x4, but then you're using even more lumber and getting less, right? A 4x12 garden and a 4x4 garden, you're going to have more pathways. You're going to have less garden space per area in your overall garden space. So the bigger the bed is, the more gardening area you're getting per lumber. And the more square it is, the more gardening area you're getting per lumber. But then there's a point where it's so large that you can't reach the middle, or you have to step into it, or maybe there's different designs called a keyhole. You can put some sort of thing to walk on it. There's different solutions to that. I can talk more about that as we go along here. But I got a garden over here, for instance. So I got a space here where it just didn't make sense to have two 4x8s. This is a large garden. It's maybe 8x7, I'd say, and total outside edge to outside edge, about 8x7. I guess another point is that all your gardens don't have to be the same. You can sort of shape them to be what you need them to be. That's one great thing about rocks. You can change the dimensions anytime you want, really. It's like Lego, right? So this garden is an awkward shape. It's very difficult to get into the middle without stepping on the soil. So what I tend to do is grow two things in it. I tend to grow one thing in the middle that I don't really need to tend, and I grow something on the perimeter that I do need to tend. So last year, all around the perimeter here, I had kale, just hugging the rocks all the way around. Easy to reach, because kale I use the cut and come again method. Take off, basically take a couple leaves off 12 plants. You got a bowl of kale. Looks like you haven't even picked anything. You're basically pruning the kale. If the leaves stay on too long, they start to go bad. In the center of the garden, I grew onions. Because you don't really do anything with onions. You just let them grow until it's time to harvest them. So, I put down a 2-3 inch mulch, planted the onion sets around this time of year, and then I just let the middle take care of itself all season long last year. This year, I'm going to plant beans, bush beans around the edge, because you got to get at those. And in the center, I'm going to plant corn, because you don't really do anything with corn until it's time to pick the corn, right? So you kind of just leave it for a good amount of time. So you're not going in and out, right? Whereas beans, you got to pick them every 2 days, basically. When the beans start producing, every 2 days you're picking beans, right? So it would be a pain to have beans in the middle, and I've done it in the past. I had this whole garden beans once. And it's a pain. So I just have something in the middle that's doesn't require getting at. Here around the perimeter of my garden, right, I got a fence, and you might have a fence. Maybe it's up against your house, or it's up against your neighbor's fence, or if you're like me, you've got a forest out there and you're trying to keep animals out, deer and rabbits and porcupines and such, right? So this is my solution to that. I like this configuration. So I've got a 4x8 bed here, I've got a 4x8 bed here, and then at the end, right, I've got this little, it's about 2 feet by 2 feet, okay, up against the fence. So that way I'm still getting a little bit of garden here, and I'm finding that perennials are a good thing to stuff in these. It's really not big enough to do much with, right? So here I've got some lemon thyme growing, and it's a good place to stuff your herbs, right? So I've got lemon thyme in here, but I can lean in and I can get over here, right? I could lean in and get over here. If this came out any further, I wouldn't be able to get at the back of the garden, right? So 4x8, 4x8, 2x2. It's kind of a keyhole design, backing up against the wall. I can access everything, and I can get at the garden. Another good point. How far apart should the beds be? Right? The closer the beds are together, the more of your land you're making gardenable. But the problem, and I'll show you the contrast, is that if this is too narrow, then you can't square up to the bed, right? So let's say this was half this width. Well, then I could just sort of, let's say this board was right here, right? Then I'd have to sort of do everything twisted sideways. It'd be very uncomfortable, and I got a lot of beds like that because I built them that way to make more efficient use of the space. But because it's so uncomfortable to tend the garden, a lot of things don't get looked after because it's not comfortable. So whatever this distance is for you, it's quite far for me because I've got long legs, right? But you should be able to put your knee on the ground on a pad and, have your foot on the ground without getting stuck in there. So the way I did it was I sort of just put my hand in front of my knee and my hand behind my foot, kneeling in this position and measured that distance. And that's how far, for me, is the ideal spacing between the beds, because that way you can get in, you can maneuver a wheelbarrow. It's just really easy to service the garden. Let me show you a bed that I didn't build that way. So all the beds going down this side, you know, see, I put this massive space in between the beds. Really, it's a waste of space. It doesn't need to be any wider than that dimension I just showed you. But then these beds, I made the space nothing, right? If you look over here, right? I just didn't make it wide enough, right? So, I mean, you've got a bed, you're going to spend some time at the end of the bed, but when you're picking and harvesting and tending and just doing stuff, you're spending all your time in that space, because it's broadside to the length of the garden, right? So I can tell you that, you know, I tend to do awkward things, like I'll have one knee here and I'll have one knee, all my weight on the corner of this thing leaning in, right? And I'll be like this, right? Now, some of you young whippersnappers, that might not be such a big deal. But you know, I'm 47, I'll be 48 really soon. And yeah, these things start to affect you as time goes on. You get a little less spry, a little less flexible, right? So yeah, I wish I'd made these a little further apart. Or sometimes I even do this. I'll kneel on them like this. And it's just not good, right? It should be comfortable. I mean, when you're out in your garden, it should be relaxing. It should be peaceful. You shouldn't be doing things that are painful or uncomfortable for your bodies. Why would you, right? You're out here to grow food, but you're also out here to relax and have a good time, sort of thing. It shouldn't be hard on you. So, spacing, very important. You know, sure, if everything's tightly packed together, you can get more stuff growing out of the land you've got. But if you've got some space, or if you just want to make things comfortable for yourself, right? Toe to knee, whatever that is for you, that's the space you need. Here I have a garden that's more like, I don't know, 6x5 or something like that. Let me see. Yeah, this bed's 6x5. I like this dimension, and I can reach the middle, right? I got my knee down here, I can reach the middle. It's sort of at the edge of what's comfortable, but it is a useful configuration in lots of different ways, and you sort of can get at the corners. And the advantage of having a more square garden is that it's less of an obstacle. You can get around it. You can sort of walk. It just makes it easier to negotiate the space in your garden when you've got something more square. These are rectangles, but they're more square-like, right? So the more square you can make your rectangle, there's advantages there too. But it's all a question of getting gardening area out of your lumber, if you're using lumber, and being able to reach it. Of course, it doesn't all have to be about buying wood, right? These were just made out of dead fallen trees from my neighborhood, right? Just different trees that died. That's a perfectly fine thing to border a garden. I guess I should speak to why I like to have everything sort of up in a box and that sort of thing. And it's because I mulch all my beds. And I guess that's a perfect segue to the next topic, is mulching and soil and that sort of thing, the considerations of soil. So let's change spots here. Let me find a good spot. So here we're looking at the forest behind my garden, the forest floor. And if you take a walk through the woods, you're going to find, unless a deer has scuffed the ground up or a bear or something, you're never going to find bare earth. It's always covered with something, right? And there's many benefits for the soil in doing that. Soil organisms like having decaying plant matter on the ground all the time. Mycorrhiza like it. And it also prevents loss of nutrients, loss of moisture, all kinds of positive benefits. So I practice the same thing in my garden, right? There's a strawberry bed covered in some sort of mulch. This is raspberries over here, some sort of mulch. This bed over here is going to be zucchini this year. Nothing's planted. It's way too early for zucchini to be planted right now. But there's a mulch I put on it last fall. Every one of my beds is always covered all the time. When I built this garden, did I run out to a garden center and buy a bunch of soil? No. I used what was here. Did I have good soil here? No. It's all rocks and clay and stuff like that. Right? A good deal of the rocks in these rock bordered gardens just came up out of the ground here. Right? The natural soil in Nova Scotia tends to be a lot of clay, a lot of rocks. That's sort of high acidity, or acid anyway, on the acid side of things. This was just a pile of weeds, pretty much. Now the good thing is that if you've got, if where you want to put a garden in, there's weeds growing there, you know something can grow there, right? But the existing, like any one of these beds, if you dig in, you find this here. This is a strawberry bed. Nice, soft, beautiful black stuff. That's not what I started with, okay? That is not this beautiful black gold. That's not what I started with. I started with brown, slimy clay with rocks in it. For a lot of the beds, I initially, put a little box around it or a border like this and put horse manure. Or, if I didn't do that, I built what's called a hugelkultur bed, and I've got lots of videos on that. I'll put it at the end. That's a good solution for people that don't have a source of composted horse manure. If you can find composted horse manure that's basically been sitting in a pile for a year, there's certain things you wouldn't want to plant in that. I would stay away, at least in the first year, from planting root vegetables. You could have good results, or you're running risks of there being sort of pathogens in that affect your potatoes or your carrots. It's a risk. But if you had a year-aged horse manure, you could plant tomatoes in that. You could plant squash in that. Plant cucumbers in that. There's all kinds of things. Basically, a plant that has roots in the ground and the part you're eating is above and up, right? You can do that. So any new bed, if you've got manure and let's say it's just been aged for a year, that sort of thing, just plant something in it that's going to put its root in the ground, but it's going to give you the food above the ground. Put a mulch over that manure, and the following year, you're going to have this stuff, this nice black stuff, right? Lots of people say, oh, manure, it's full of, I use horse manure is the cheapest kind of manure you can get. Often you can get it for free. And it's also the weakest manure. That's why you can plant in it. That's why you can treat it like a soil. It's in terms of the number of NPK, right? It's got the least amount of everything sort of thing. So you can treat it like in soil and plant in it. But it's full of weed seeds. Most manures are full of weed seeds, except maybe chicken manure, because chicken process everything. But chicken manure is super strong, right? So people always say, what about the weed seeds? Well, you solve that by having 2 or 3 inches of mulch over the manure. I'm not saying that's going to solve all your problems, but a lot of different kinds of weed seeds, they really can't germinate unless the sun's shining right down on the soil and getting them warm enough. Or if they do germinate, they can't fight their way through a thick mulch. And even if that is a risk, there's other ways around it, and I've done lots of videos on this, where like, let's say I've got a large bed, and I'm going to plant pumpkin. Let's say I've got a bed that's 4 by 8, I guess that's not that large, but I'm going to plant zucchini in that bed. So a bed that size, I might plant 6 zucchini, okay, maybe 8. So I'm going to put the horse manure down, and then I'm going to cover the whole thing with leaf bags. People put out their leaves in these big brown bags. You cover that hole, all that manure with leaf bags, and you cut a hole about this big, right? About the size of a softball or volleyball in the paper. And that's where you plant your pumpkin or your squash or your zucchini or whatever it is, right? And then you put the mulch, all the leaves that came in the leaf bag, you put that on top of the bags to keep them from blowing away. If it's really windy where you are, you can put some sticks and stuff like that on top of the leaves. There's various ways you can keep leaves from blowing away. It's very windy where I am, right? Often gets up to 100 kilometers an hour, 80 kilometers an hour. Just this week we were in that territory. So I mean, I can get it to work, so you can probably get it to work too. If you're somewhere rural like me, I find just putting a couple spruce boughs over the leaves keeps them from blowing away for the most part. There's still some that blow around, right? But it's not really a big deal. Anyway, you've got that paper on the horse manure. The weed seeds that are in it are going to germinate. They can't get through the paper. I'm not speaking to every single weed in the world, okay? There are some weeds that are just invincible. I know that, right? But most of the things that are growing in a field where the hay is grown for the horse, they can't deal with that sort of thing. So the seed germinates, it hits the paper, can't get through, dies, becomes fertilizer, right? So it works. Now, people always bring up the issue of using hay and horse manure. Does it have herbicides in it? Does the horse manure have deworming? I can't speak to every single stable, okay? I did not, I think I hardly used any horse manure. I might have used 1 bucket of horse manure on a new bed, an experiment I tried last year. Other than that, I didn't use it at all in my garden. But the place I used to get it from, which doesn't even run anymore really, there used to be a stable down the road. They just keep 1 or 2 horses now, and they use their own. Oh, I can't get manure from them anymore, so I don't bother getting manure. But they don't, you know, they deworm. They give the horse deworming stuff if it has worms. Otherwise, they don't. And their hay isn't treated with herbicides and stuff like that. So you have to, wherever you're getting your horse manure, your hay, or whatever from, you just ask them, right? I've never had it be a problem at all. In terms of different types of mulches, so we're talking about soil here, and I'm talking a lot about horse manure. Do you need to use horse manure or any other kind of manure to have great soil? No, not at all. That's why I like using the hugelkultur method. The hugelkultur method just means you dig a trench in the ground, you throw a bunch of rotten logs and stuff like that and leaves and yard waste in the hole, and then all the soil you dug out goes on top. All that plant matter and then you mulch that on top. All the plant matter that's underneath the soil gradually breaks down. There's different organisms moving around, they're redistributing that through the soil. Also the mulch that's on top of it is perpetually breaking down, and that's feeding the soil. Maybe 30% of my bed, that's way more work, putting in a hugelkultur bed, because step 1 is basically digging a grave, a shallow grave, like 18 inches deep sort of thing, so it's some work. If you've got some help around, or you've just got lots of energy or strength, it's a good use of all of that vitality. But it's a really, really good system, especially if you have a source of yard waste, rotten logs and stuff like that, because you're just using your own soil. But even just keeping the soil covered in a mulch, any kind of mulch, the soil gradually improves in time. And some mulches improve the soil more than others. There's all kinds of different arguments on that. For me, basically, the mulches that break down the fastest are the ones that improve the soil the fastest, right? Because they're breaking down, they're turning into not mulch, right? If it's breaking down fast, that means it's going through a worm and becoming worm poop, or it's going in and out of some other organism, right? Or fungi, or basically all the organisms that are there are breaking that thing down into the stuff that makes plants grow well. So if you put a mulch down and it disappears in a season, that mulch has become something that's going to be really good next year. So some mulches are way slower to break down than others. Those are going to improve your soil far more slowly than others, right? I find things like pine needles, wood chips, stuff like that, they break down very slowly. They do improve the soil, but they do it very slowly. Whereas things like grass, hay, straw is a bit slower. Leaves are sort of in between. Leaves are a good medium. Seaweed works, but it breaks down quickly and it doesn't conserve moisture. You think it would, but it doesn't. The soil underneath weed, I've done experiments and I find in the height of summer, the soil underneath seaweed is a bit drier than the soil underneath leaves. I find leaves is one of the best ones, of the ones that are easy to get a hold of. If you watch the Back to Eden film, and they make it sound like these wood chips are really easy to come by. It really depends on where you live and how the municipalities run and that sort of stuff. Where I live here, Halifax, it's just about impossible to get them. You got to pay to get them, and if you live out in the sticks like I do, you got to hold someone's hold somebody for ransom to get some. It's just very difficult to get wood chips out here. I've just sort of given up on it. I like using them. I used to use them all the time, but they're hard to come by. So necessity's the mother of invention. I just basically troll people's properties on garbage day and take people's leaf bags. And I like grass clippings. I mean, there is the risk of the person treating their lawn and you're putting that in your garden. Where I live, you're not allowed to really do that, so it's not so much of a risk. You can also sort of stake out different people. If someone has a perfect golf green lawn, they're probably treating their lawn. If their lawn's full of weeds and stuff like that, then they're probably not treating it. It's probably the good stuff. Really, the two easiest things to come by for me, I find, are the best. Leaves, grass clippings. And this time of year, it's the best because I got a neighbor down the street This guy must be tough as nails. He rakes his entire lawn. Everybody here where I live has a large lawn. Everybody has like an acre of property. This guy rakes his whole lawn. And maybe he uses a mower with a bag on it, I don't know, but it doesn't look like that. It's not finely shredded up. This guy rakes his whole lawn, and he puts it all in these big bags and puts it at the end of the driveway, and I take it, right? So I use that. I find that stuff is incredible. It breaks down, it lasts a season, and it just becomes this black stuff. You look under, it's about this high. Let's say I put a bunch of that on top of potatoes, and every month it goes down, and by like October it's maybe just a couple inches thick, and there's all this black stuff, right? That's a great way to improve soil. If you've got a limited supply of horse manure, maybe there's a couple beds you want to give the richest stuff to, because they're going to grow something that year one building your garden, that bed is going to be a high feeder, a heavy feeder. So you've got another bed where you're just using the soil that's there. Plant beans or peas in it. Plant beans or peas in that soil, because peas and beans, they pull nitrogen out of the air and fix it in their roots. So they don't need an amazing soil to produce results. So if you've got a new garden bed and you're using the existing soil and you're not so sure what you're working with, just plant those things in there, because they're going to grow anyway. And if you, instead of pulling the beans out at the end of the season, you just cut them off, some of that nitrogen that was fixed in the roots will stay there. So you're just making the soil, just leave the roots right there. They'll rot over the winter. They'll just sort of liquefy and get eaten by the soil organisms. They'll be gone the next year. That's just a great way to work with a new soil that you're not so sure about. And it's always fun to just roll the dice and plant something and see what happens. You can do a soil test as well to find out exactly what you need with your soil. I can say, as a pretty successful gardener, I've never done a soil test in my life. A soil test for me is planting something and seeing what happens. And then, if the results are poor, you take a guess at what went wrong and try to deal with it. Keeping everything mulched seems to solve just about everything, for me anyway. Unless you've got some really unique set of conditions in your soil. If you got your soil perpetually mulched, you've got organisms in that soil perpetually working on that mulch, and they're just basically tilling and working away on a microscopic sort of level, and there's something going into them and there's something coming out of them, and whatever's coming out of them is good for your plants. It's kind of like insect manure, and it'll just get better over time. So sometimes if you're in a great spot with great soil, that's great. If you're not, you maybe have to bring something in. If it's extremely rocky and you can't get into the ground, then yeah, you got to build up, right? I would be, and I'm not saying don't buy soil from a landscaping supplier. I'm just saying, whatever soil they're selling, they're going to say it's the greatest thing in the world. I would manage your expectations in that soil. It's whatever you're going to get from them, it's going to be better after a few years if you keep it covered. I can guarantee you that. Right? And if you can source something like a well-composted horse manure, I would take it over that landscaping center, or those bags of soil you buy at the gardening center. I would take well-composted for a vegetable garden. I would take well-composted horse manure over those things any day. It's cheaper, you can get more of it. I've done experiments here where I've taken, I think they have something here called triple awesome gold mix, or something like that. So it's got some name like that. I had one bed with zucchini in it. Right next to it, I had a bed with just horse manure, right? Year-aged horse manure. The zucchini and the horse manure outgrew that stuff like 2-to-1 sort of thing, right? So if you can get horse manure, use that, because it's just cheap. All right, well, I think I've hit on just about everything I can think of to hit on, off the top of my head anyway. I hope we gave you something good to chew on there. I tried to go into every subject as thoroughly as I can. Building a new garden space or expanding your garden space or making a decision to start a garden, there's a lot of little decisions you have to make. And I guess it's also important to note you don't have to get it all right. There used to be a fence right here where that tree is. I just removed it this year. Why did I ever put that damn fence there? Right? Every year I change my mind about how I've designed my space. And that'll probably never change. If there's one thing that'll never change, it'll be the fact that I'm going to change my mind every year. I mean, you come up with an idea, and then you see how it works. And then you evaluate the outcome, and if something needs to be changed, you change it. That's the process. That's life, right? And if you stay at it, stay with the problem, keep jotting down those ideas, review them on the cold winter months, and try something new every year, your garden's going to get better. You're going to have some failures, but the trend is going to be upward. You're going to have success over time if you stay at it. Keep reading, watch lots of YouTube videos, read lots of books, and it will get better over time. I guess there's one more thing I wanted to speak to, this notion of green thumb. There's no such thing. I know lots of people like to use that term, but it's a question of being persistent and staying with the problem, learning patience, and learning patience, but also just learning about the thing you're doing, right? I think anyone that's new to gardening says, well, I'm just going to do this and I'm going to do that and I'm going to have a garden. And then it doesn't work and they're like, I guess I don't have a green thumb. No, you barely know what you're doing. You're a novice, right? You can get lucky. I used to live in a part of the province where the growing conditions are better. The natural soil is better and the growing conditions are better. I have a great garden every year. First year I had a good garden. I always had a great garden. Then I moved here. In the first couple of years, I had to fight. I had to fight to get things to grow here. Now I don't have to fight. Things grow pretty easily here now. There's a couple little things I do to make up for the fact that it's a bit cold and kind of overcast sometimes. But I learned how to garden here, right? And no matter where you are, if things aren't working out, just stay with the problem. Come up with some harebrained scheme for the following year. Try that, right? Stay with it. It's worth it. It's worth it because eventually you'll get it. You talk to enough people, you ask lots of people. If something didn't go right for you, it's because you got to change something. And it's your job to figure out what you need to change, right? And the best way to figure that out is to read and learn from people that are good at the thing you're trying to learn how to do. That's the best. If I see another gardener and their tomatoes look bigger, or like, how did you do that? I want to stop what I'm doing now. I want to do what you're doing now because you're getting better results. I want to understand what you're doing. That should be your first instinct when someone gets better results from you. Not to think, oh, I must not have a green thumb. No, you should like, I can learn from this person. This person's doing something I'm not. This person understands something, or maybe they're just, the conditions are different where they are. Understand that, right? It's worth learning. Anyway, I think I've gone on enough. I hope this was an interesting video for you. I hope I gave you something to chew on there and some ideas. If I did, please like, share, subscribe. Check out my podcast, maritimegardening.com. You can have an awesome garden. You can have a large garden. It's not going to break your back. It's not impossible to do. It's totally doable. So until next time, get out there. Get at it. Build that dream garden. Have a great gardening season. Thanks for watching.